We live in a very exciting time in medicine. Some are calling it the dawn of an era of precision medicine, which is this notion that we could soon be capable of giving each individual patient exactly what they need, when they need it, and the amount they need it. That particular concept overlaps significantly with another concept that's receiving increasing emphasis, and that's the concept of equity, health equity. The definition of health equity is almost the same as precision medicine. Together, they really hold a lot of promise for the elimination of health disparities, a problem that has deep historical roots and is a real present-day reality. That is, people who are dying or ill for no reason other than their status in society, be it racial or otherwise. Our aim in this new era, pull together and leverage all these new emerging capabilities, scientific understanding of human biology, combining that with new methodologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence to produce this golden era. The problem is that for deep, long-lasting reasons, very often medicine has been quite imprecise and equity has been absent. Around the turn of the 20th century, that is around 1890, an influential statistician, a man who had correctly predicted an association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer 70 years before the Surgeon General announced the association of those two things. A respected guy. Looking at statistics, he predicted the extinction of African Americans. He explained it by suggesting that the traits, he called it, and tendencies of African Americans would lead to their extinction. Now, by traits, he was referring to genetic traits. By tendencies, he was referring to behavioral aspects of their lives. This was a flagrant case of essentially blaming the victim. He completely ignored the fact that the African Americans under his observation were 2 or 3 decades out of slavery, and that at that point in time, any rights, any property, any resources that they had managed to accumulate, that small number of rights, were being fairly viciously removed in a post-Reconstruction era backlash. He looked at the people and blamed them for the state of their health. That was easy at the time because there was a prevailing notion, particularly among the majority population, that African Americans were generally inferior, physically and otherwise. Therefore, this was the natural order of things. So studying the disparities assumed a pretty low priority for the scientific community. The study of African Americans in particular was relegated to a few studies that really wound up in the minds of the investigators reinforcing the notions of inferiority. With that sort of prevailing approach to black health, decades later, we find ourselves with low levels of actual data and a fairly biased body of knowledge as we entered the second half of the 20th century. It's important to note, however, that there was a countervailing current of thought that went against these popular notions. And probably the leading proponents of that were leadership in the National Medical Association, which is the African American Association of Doctors, founded before the turn of the century. Those physicians were not allowed to join the American Medical Association at the time. So they came together and put together an influential organization that exists and is vigorous to this very day. But they pushed the notion that this was not evidence of inferiority. This was evidence of the societal conditions that African Americans lived under. Other leaders like W.B. Du Bois put it very simply, and he said essentially that it's not because of things that the African Americans are inherently made of, but rather the circumstances under which they live out their lives. Those are very different from the people you're comparing them to. It's a simple notion, and he backed it up with a very rigorous study in which he went out into the community of Philadelphia, collected data door to door quantified it, and applied, at the time, the most advanced statistical approaches to analyzing the data. And he came up with a notion that now, for many people in the modern times, consider an epiphany, that social determinants of health are critical in determining the health status. So you have these two notions as we enter the latter half of the 20th century. The seeds planted by people like W.B. Du Bois and those leaders of the NMA really came to blossom, I think, in the late 20th century, and a particular high watermark is the commissioning of the Heckler report. Secretary Margaret Heckler of the HHS commissioned a report that pulled together scholars of all races in the United States who were leading experts in understanding disparities. And they put forth before the research community and the medical community in general the fact that Black and minority health was a serious issue, that it needed a focused attention. And some of the quotes from her introductory letter are really important, where she recalls or states for everyone, in clear terms, that disparities are real. She pointed out different statistics such as the doubling of infant mortality for African Americans versus whites, and that this is an embarrassment, an affront, she used the word, to the genius of American medicine, and it needed attention. That then stimulated a real burst of interest and academic, intellectual attention on the issues of health disparities. And many other landmark publications have come since then, such that it's clear that we have ongoing disparities and it's a real public health concern. There are many areas in which that history that I alluded to earlier left the national database on health of African Americans particularly wanting. One good example that really even exists today is the fact that 80% of the information we have on the human genome is derived from populations that have ancestry in Northwestern Europe. So, there's very little genetic information stored in national databases that reflects a significant portion of the population and a significant portion of humankind. Again, as we talk about precision medicine, which in part is very dependent upon understanding genetic processes and epigenetic processes, as we talk about precision, things like that reflect a deep need for data that is diverse in its origin and unbiased in its collection. So what do we do? How do you go from a state of distrust and ignorance that prevails when it comes to understanding African American health and disease, to a knowledge that could potentially lead to this era of precision medicine for everyone? Precision medicine and equity married. Well, knowledge is power. So you do the research. Doing the research requires a lot, particularly if it involves humans. If you're talking about a population that has suffered tremendously under the status quo, getting the trust of that particular population to involve themselves in studies. And again, the history shows that involvement in medical studies for African Americans often didn't go very well. We can go back to the founding of modern obstetrics and gynecology and experimental surgeries that were done on African Americans, the well-known Tuskegee study. So the history is not one that would necessarily engender trust. This is where studies like the Jackson Heart Study become very important. The Jackson Heart Study is, by some, considered one of the most important studies in African American health that's ever been done. And it is not over, which is the great thing. It continues even today. And some refer to it as the Black Framingham, which in a way is very flattering because Framingham has been so remarkable in its contributions to our understanding of cardiovascular disease. However, the Jackson Heart Study is actually more than an epidemiological study. It also invests directly and tremendously in the development of new scientists from diverse backgrounds who form this transgenerational bridge to hopefully replacing a legacy of disease and distress and early death with a legacy of hope as well as health. So the Jackson Heart Study then went into the Jackson community to recruit people to participate in this longitudinal study about cardiovascular disease in African Americans, which really was quite unprecedented, particularly if you combine the educational and the community activist aspects of the study. But in order to get it done, we obviously needed people to trust us. And that's a whole story in and of itself. I'll just say here that without first showing your commitment to the people in multiple ways, then you don't stand on strong footing when it comes to asking them to do something that may be in some ways abstract, that may not directly benefit the people participating, but may be of great benefit to their children. To help people understand all of that takes a lot of legwork and a lot of trust building. You don't just walk into a community and start collecting data. That won't work. Whatever data you get would probably be quite biased and non-representative. And the Jackson Heart Study continues to work to fill some of those gaps that we have in the basic understanding of cardiovascular disease in the Black community. Other studies are important, and there are numerous examples of good work that's going on now. But I think at the bottom of the good work always has to be placing the community that you want to help at the center of your considerations about study design, how you're approaching the community, what questions you're going to ask, and what outcomes you seek. I think it's important to balance our ideas about Black health, let's call it, very carefully. Because there has been so much written about disparities, that really becomes the picture of Black health for a lot of people. That is, shortened lives that are attended with a lot of disease and misery, right? It's important to focus, as I've said already, to focus the attention of the medical and research community on these disparities. And when you go back to W.B. Du Bois and those leaders, what they were saying essentially is that, of course there are disparities, of course there are disparities. Look at the circumstances under which people live, right? Look, not only, I'm not just talking about poverty, but the stressors that really come along with the Black experience. And we're focusing on African Americans as an example of some of the challenges that other marginalized groups tend to have. But there's another reality, and that reality is that there's a big amount of heterogeneity among African Americans, just like everybody else. All African Americans aren't having the same experience, and they're not having the same outcome. And in fact, if we think about it, and it becomes obvious when I say it, and that is that actually, given those circumstances I've been describing, it is quite remarkable that African Americans, many African Americans, have long lives, thrive, are vigorous, happy people. And that's a story that gets buried in our concern about disparities. One of the studies that we wanted to look at was the notion of resilience among African Americans, because I think that is the real story of Africans in North America since 1619. That is that they have overcome much. One of the quotes I like is James Baldwin, as he was walking through Harlem in the 60s and looking around, and he said, you know, the wonder is not how many people are ruined. The wonder is how many survive. And I think focusing in on that wonder is important. It helps us, I think, appreciate not only African American resilience, but human resilience. It's a characteristic that we don't understand fully, that in the past has been primarily a focus of the people who are interested in mental health, and it's a really critical concept there. I'm interested in the resilience, the overcoming of adversity among people who maintain cardiovascular health when in fact you would predict the opposite. Is there such a group? We did a study called MECA, and MECA actually is still going on. We pulled together a team both here at Morehouse and my good colleagues at Emory to look at across the Atlanta metro, are there communities where you would find unexpected health and resilience among African Americans? Not to get into the details of the study, but it is interesting that first, we found communities that, despite the fact that they had equivalent levels of socioeconomic status, I'm speaking of black communities, equivalent socioeconomic status, vast differences in cardiovascular health. So we then said, okay, this does exist. There are people who are overcoming despite the challenges that they are meeting, that heterogeneity I was talking about. So how do we explain it? And we're actively looking at that. But some of the things that, for instance, jump out, just to give you a taste of the study, on the population level, they speak to the importance of social connectedness and social cohesion within the community. That these concepts, and a lot of people would say these are soft ideas, but the data is hard. The data is clear that when in communities that had those characteristics, that cardiovascular health among African Americans was measurably, statistically significantly higher than in communities that could not be described in that way, that had issues with social cohesion and social connectedness. And you can imagine that gentrification and disruption of old neighborhoods could very well be not at all positive development for many neighborhoods. But Mecca goes on, and we're looking beyond the social level. We're looking down to the individual clinical level and even the genomic and epigenetic connections that might help explain why some groups do better than others, given roughly similar environmental exposures. Again, we must understand that heterogeneity is an important consideration when we are studying different groups. And we have precision in mind. I mean, the real essence of precision is recognizing heterogeneity and that different people will need different things. So again, precision and equity are overlapping concepts, and I think together they are synergistic if we consider them simultaneously. In studies like Mecca, it's important, as I said earlier, that the investigators have an open mind and are sensitized to some of the overall issues that I've tried to sort of lay out previously. And it's important to bring to the investigation a diversity of perspectives as we consider what questions to ask and how to interpret what we get back. So it can't be just one group that has always sort of been in charge of those kinds of aspects of research. We really have to broaden the lenses that sort of focus in on these questions. A lot of the work in Mecca and other parts of our research program are conducted by a very diverse group. In Mecca, there is a group of postdoctoral trainees who really do a lot of the hard legwork for us. And we try to be sure that their work is recognized in the publications that come out, and placing them as first authors on the papers, I think, gives them the credit that they deserve. It's also, I think, in this era approaching precision, that we leverage some of the new technologies that are out there for improving the data that we have on individuals and groups. Mobile health offers opportunities for us to collect real-time data in a very unobtrusive way from a large number of people. Those type of technological studies and interventions historically have come late to disadvantaged groups. So what we like to do is to take those cutting-edge, high-tech approaches and, involve the people that we serve most often here at Morehouse School of Medicine, involve them in those studies and those interventions and those trials that often things have to trickle down to them to gain the benefits and the fruits of that work. We also believe that precision and equity will be enhanced by utilizing some of the modern tools of research. MOYO is a cluster of studies that we have here at Morehouse, at the Cardiovascular Research Institute, that uses cell phones, remote monitoring devices, to unobtrusively gather some fairly granular information, granular data on everyday lives that may actually give us new insights into what things are affecting health. Insights that we have not been able to capture when we have people come into clinic once every year and do an assessment and then take those results and look for insights. That approach has been very useful and productive, but imagine if you have real-time, asynchronously gathered data on a population that is experiencing higher risk for a certain outcome. That may open up the door to new approaches and new hope. So we've engaged and embraced that approach to data in our MOYO studies. And the inaugural MOYO study really looked at a younger population with the notion of how do we prevent the development of hypertension. Hypertension is a leading risk factor for cardiovascular disease and something that is highly prevalent in African American population. So the populations, it is at high risk for the eventual development of high blood pressure. In fact, by the time an African American man in the Jackson Heart Study reaches the age of 60, 85% of that population has high blood pressure. Almost everybody is a patient. So clearly a major public health issue. And we're applying principles of mobile health and data gathering remotely to help look at that particular problem and to come up with new solutions for prevention. High-tech studies, new capabilities, new computing power, new insights relating to the genome, the human genome, and epigenetic phenomena, and other omics investigations and possibilities for gathering data are exciting. But if we see the era of precision as merely the advance in our ability to do these high-tech approaches, and we don't really attend to other relevant issues of people, then what we risk is merely perpetuating or even exacerbating some of the disparities that we experience now. And why do I say that? Well, historically, new advances always favor the already favored. They come first to the populations that are enjoying the best health, the best economic stability, and so on. We have to be intentional about understanding issues that limit equity and keeping those firmly in mind as we do our research. There are so many examples historically of people being involved in research but not even knowing the results of the research, let alone reaping, again, the fruits of that effort. That is all too often the story. And what we want to be sure to emphasize is that as we approach this era of ultimate precision, where people get exactly what they need, they're not looked at as an average patient, but they're looked at as you. As we approach that era, it's important to fully understand that at the center of all this are those very individuals, their needs, their wishes, their hopes. If we approach our research with the appropriate levels of humility, with an appropriate prioritization of those things that all physicians hold dear, I think we'll stay on the right track. Health disparities, they are a real issue. Resilience of African Americans is a real phenomenon. The power of these new tools is very exciting. All of these considerations need to come together if indeed we as physicians, cardiologists, are going to be part of this ushering in of this new era of precision and equity. There are many new developments, none more exciting than the prospects of what artificial intelligence, machine learning can bring to bear. We're engaged in a very exciting study that looks at the issues surrounding equity and artificial intelligence. There are real issues there. If we could possibly resolve those, consider what that could mean. It would place the patient at the very center of what we do as a medical and a research enterprise. It could potentially decentralize care and put so much in the hands of the patient, discretion, their goals, their priorities. We could move from the centuries-old paradigm of seeing a patient as an average patient, the trial and error of testing this drug on them, trying this approach and waiting to see in an iterative fashion what works. The new era bypasses that and with laser focus takes us to right back to where we really all began, and that is taking care of that person sitting right in front of you.
I think it's important for us to start by stating that South Asians are those who claim ancestry from countries such as Bhutan, Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal, India, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. And that is certainly different from other South Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries, which is certainly a fundamental source of confusion. Cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of global mortality and is a major contributor to disability worldwide. Notably, while the global prevalence of cardiovascular disease has continued to increase over time, some of the highest changes related to poor cardiovascular health are found in South Asian countries. For example, countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal have some of the highest rates of ischemic heart disease and ischemic stroke. Closer to home, evidence suggests that compared to other Asian groups living in America, Asian Indian men and women have some of the highest mortality rates related to ischemic heart disease. Notably, while rates were downtrending for all Asian groups over the course of time, we saw some of the highest mortalities, or we saw an upswing in mortality as of 2011, particularly in Asian Indian men and women. It's also important to note that South Asians living in any of these countries or in the diaspora suffer from cardiovascular disease at rates almost double that of those of European ancestry. Perhaps more alarming, if we look into South Asian subgroups, we find that Bangladeshi adults suffer from cardiovascular mortality at a rate of 4 times that, and Pakistani adults at a rate of 3 times that compared to those of other South Asian ancestry. This further highlights the importance of disaggregating South Asian data. And so the question is why? Why is the risk higher? Certainly there's been a global effort to try to answer this question, but I think to understand the why and the challenge of managing cardiovascular risk in this group, we need to understand its origins. Over the course of time, this subcontinent has been under the rule of various empires that have influenced the region by bringing with them their own culture, language, religion, cuisine, identity, certainly enriching the fabric of the area, but this has likely driven political and geopolitical differences among ruling groups. The South Asia that we know today is the result of imperialism under the rule of the British. Around 1600, a British trade company called the East India Company was established to facilitate trade with the East. It wasn't until rebellions against this same East India Company by native South Asians that forced the British to reorganize its army, the financial system, and administration in India, ultimately putting India under the direct rule of the British Empire in what was then called the British Raj. Fast forward to 1947, we saw the British abruptly leave the subcontinent, partitioning into 2 independent self-governing nations, a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. Immediately, there began one of the largest forced migrations in human history, as millions of Muslims trekked west and east, and millions of Hindus headed in the opposite direction. Across the subcontinent, communities that had coexisted for almost a millennium attacked each other in terrifying outbreaks of sectarian violence. The formation of modern-day Sri Lanka came about politically in 1972, and a war between East and West Pakistan resulted in the formation of modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so what we're left with, it looks like modern-day South Asia, all of which ultimately influenced their personal views of healthcare. So what about immigration to America? Well, after initial documentation of Punjab farmers, there was little immigration in light of discriminatory regulations. Naturalization rights and extended quotas allowed 100 Indians and 100 Pakistanis per year to immigrate, thanks to laws that were passed in 1946. These quotas were ultimately lifted in 1965, which allowed and encouraged skilled professionals from South Asian countries to immigrate to the United States. And finally, a third wave arrived in the mid-1980s, allowing parents and extended families of those previously settled professionals to come to America. To date, Indian Americans dominate the South Asian immigrant population in the United States. From a population perspective, South Asians are one of the fastest growing minority groups in the United States. And so it's imperative that the health needs of this minority group are critically examined for a variety of reasons. The first is to ensure culturally appropriate medical and health services. The second is to address a variety of health conditions that they face. And the third is to create informed policy decisions. And lastly, is to improve current and future clinical research in this group. And we, among those in the healthcare force, certainly have an opportunity to become more influential, considering that Asians are the majority of the minority workforce across most domains in the United States. Fortunately, there was a rise in awareness towards the end of the last decade, starting with a American Heart Association scientific statement in 2018. This was then followed by efforts by the American College of Cardiology and the National Lipid Association. It's difficult to speak about South Asian cardiovascular health without talking about risk factors that are influential to this community. There are common lipid abnormalities that we see. One is of atherogenic dyslipidemia, characterized by elevated triglycerides and low HDL. In addition, the prevalence of low HDL is as high as 50% in South Asians. Even at higher values, the protective effects of HDL seem to be weaker for South Asians presenting a first-time heart attack. Lipoprotein A is highly atherogenic and may be influential or has been associated with premature atherosclerosis. And this may be clinically significant considering that the population attributable risk for myocardial infarction is highest for South Asians when the LPA is more than 50. Depending on the definition, location, and population, the prevalence of hypertension ranges anywhere from 21% to 50%, and there is certainly regional variation depending on the country of origin. People from South Asian communities are known to be up to 4 to 6 times more likely to have type 2 diabetes than the general population. In addition, South Asians tend to have poor glycemic control, putting them at a higher risk of serious health complications. Perhaps more telling is the prevalence of prediabetes in the Masala Study that we'll talk about a little bit later. Genetic risk is commonly cited as an important risk factor, but I think it's important to note that the risk imparted by a family history is probably similar to that of other populations. Tobacco use may be underestimated considering available cultural product that can be smokeless. Compared to other racial groups, South Asians historically have the lowest prevalence rates of physical activity levels. South Asian women have very high rates of gestational diabetes, even at a BMI value of less than 23. And certainly important are social detriments of health when considering cardiovascular health. Data from the InterHeart study suggests that the population attributable risk for coronary disease for 9 traditional risk factors such as diabetes, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, physical inactivity is upwards of about 86%, suggesting that the identification and management of traditional risk factors would certainly help to mitigate cardiovascular risk in this population. This is amplified by more recent data from the UK Biobank, certainly a more contemporary cohort under the influence of modern-day medical management, confirming that factors such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and central adiposity are some of the leading associations of the observed disparity of cardiovascular risk. The next step after assessing these risk factors is to calculate the cardiovascular risk using methods that are available to us, such as the pooled cohorts equations here in the United States or the Q-RISK-3 in Europe. The estimation of risk facilitates matching intensity of therapy to one's absolute risk. So in this way, we can maximize the anticipated benefits of therapy, we can minimize the harms of overtreatment, and this allows the identification of patients who are at sufficient risk to merit treatment with a higher likelihood of net individual and societal benefit. So for the pooled cohorts equations, for example, this is a tool that has been widely validated and is broadly useful for the general US population. And overall, the PCE does fairly well, but it may overestimate risk in patients with higher socioeconomic status or who have been closely engaged in healthcare. Alternatively, it may underestimate risk in patients from certain ethnic and racial groups such as South Asians. And this is where the disparity with respects to the care of South Asians really starts to emerge. And so while risk assessment is fundamental to guiding ASCVD risk reduction, risk prediction in South Asians remains challenging for a number of reasons. First, available risk algorithms have not been derived from or prospectively validated in South Asians. So for example, data from the UK Biobank study shows that while incident cardiovascular disease was higher in South Asians, this risk was not reflected in the pooled cohorts equations or the Q-RISK-3, such that the predicted 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, according to these equations, was identical for South Asians and those of European ancestry. Second, limited considerations have been given to native versus migrant populations. And third, there is limited availability of disaggregated data, which likely masks meaningful health differences in the South Asian subpopulations. Notably, it was not until 2010 when some effort was made to help clarify race with the write-in option for other Asians. And so available population-specific risk assessment tools unreliably estimate risk in this group. And this is certainly not for a lack of trying, but rather a lack of inclusion, particularly if we are basing our risk estimation on a cohort of less than 10% South Asians. That considered, other cohorts where South Asian population is higher, currently not incorporated into any guidelines aside from the predict estimates from New Zealand with 9% South Asians. So to help understand and develop ethnic-specific recommendations, the Mediators of Atherosclerosis in South Asians Living in America study, better known as the Masala Study, was launched in 2010 and is the only prospective longitudinal study of South Asians living in America. Originally, the study was based out of UCSF and Northwestern, led by Drs. Alka Kanaya and Namrata Kandula, and as of fairly recently has taken on an additional cohort from NYU under the guidance of Dr. Nadia Islam. In addition, this has now spawned a few more studies, including the Masala 2G, which has enrolled the adult children of the original Masala cohort, as well as programs like Saheli and Sath, which are healthy lifestyle programs for South Asians. Overall, this study was designed to determine the traditional, sociocultural, behavioral, and novel risk factors associated with subclinical atherosclerosis. It was meant to compare the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors to other racial and ethnic groups living in the United States, and it was used to investigate these same risk factors and the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. The Masala study was designed with similar methods to MESA to allow for comparative analysis. Overall, it included 900 patients, age 40 to 84, free of known cardiovascular disease. In addition to traditional and novel data collection, social network history was also collected. Follow-up data is now available on over 80% of participants, and a third examination is actively ongoing. Recruitment is also ongoing, with efforts to increase South Asian diversity in the population by increasing the number of Pakistani and Bangladeshi adults. The baseline population is 98% first-generation immigrants to the United States, with the majority coming from India and Pakistan following trends that I described earlier. Data very consistent with census data in the United States shows that Asian Indians have the highest rates of education and family income of any racial and ethnic groups. This is consistent with immigration policies that we spoke about earlier that allowed those with professional degrees or those seeking higher education to immigrate to the United States. Comparing three behavioral and lifestyle variables, South Asians have very low smoking rates. Compared to other MESA groups, they drink less alcohol. And despite the higher education and knowledge of possible higher risk of coronary artery disease, South Asians suffer from some of the lowest rates of physical activity, as noted earlier. Three main dietary patterns were identified, and about 1/3 of the cohort consumed one of these three dietary patterns on a regular basis. The animal protein diet was associated with a higher BMI and higher waist circumference compared to a prudent diet. The fried snacks, sweets, and high-fat dairy pattern was closely associated with a higher blood pressure, lower HDL, and more insulin resistance compared to a prudent diet. In addition, a longer length of residence in the United States is directly associated with a higher intake of saturated fat, trans fat, dietary cholesterol, and alcohol, for example. I'd like to use the last few minutes to summarize some of the key cardiometabolic findings in the Masala study. Compared with all other ethnic groups in MESA, South Asians had greater intramuscular fat, lower hepatic attenuation, and less lean mass. South Asians had greater visceral fat compared with Chinese Americans, African Americans, and Hispanics. South Asians also had greater pericardial fat compared to African Americans. Ultimately, this less favorable body composition may partially explain the increased predisposition to cardiometabolic disease. The overall prevalence of diabetes and prediabetes is 26% and 33% respectively. Compared to the MESA study, the prevalence of diabetes is significantly higher in South Asians. Another important finding is that there is a higher incidence of glycemic progression, so transitioning from normal glucose tolerance to prediabetes and then finally developing diabetes. Hence, BMI calculations in South Asians may be unreliable, with more recent data suggesting that even a BMI of 23 may be too generous as an ideal goal, and that perhaps a target of closer to 20, especially in the presence of 2 or more coronary risk factors, may be better. Specifically, South Asians have a higher prevalence rates of overweight and obesity status and were found to be metabolically abnormal. For me, the take-home message is to test and treat risk factors regardless of BMI in this population. So how do you circumvent that? Well, We can always start with diet, and data suggests that in South Asians, a higher intake of healthful, plant-based food was associated with a favorable cardiometabolic profile, namely body composition and ectopic fat measures. They also found that greater consumption of healthy, plant-based foods was associated with the lower incidence of developing diabetes on 5 years follow-up. This provides more evidence about the need to choose more of a healthy, plant-based food items and highlights that not all plant-based or vegetarian diets are in fact healthy. In the absence of outcome data to derive a risk score specifically for South Asians, our group and others have used coronary artery calcium to help reclassify risk. As we know, coronary calcium is a robust predictor of cardiovascular events, and so testing for it provides an opportunity to help guide statin therapy along with other preventive interventions. This is a nice study showing that South Asian men had similarly elevated prevalence of coronary artery calcium compared to white men. South Asian women, on the other hand, had lower CAC prevalence than white women, but similar to other racial and ethnic groups in MESA. South Asian men and women at low and at intermediate groups by the pooled cohort equations were more likely to have a coronary artery calcium score of 0, suggesting that the extent of risk overestimation using the pooled cohorts equation may be even greater for South Asians, as we saw earlier, especially when compared to whites, the same group South Asians are classified as in the risk estimator. To extend these results, if we take into consideration that South Asian ethnicity is a risk-enhancing factor, we find that systemic considerations of borderline risk South Asians as statin candidates may result in considerable overtreatment, with nearly 55% having a coronary artery calcium score of 0. For those at intermediate risk, there is a 1 in 3 chance that an individual may very well be low risk. Inflammatory markers in coronary artery calcium likely reflect distinct pathophysiologic processes and hence provide distinct information towards cardiovascular risk. South Asians have higher CAC density and lower CAC volume. The presence of a family history of premature coronary artery disease was associated with a high burden of coronary calcium score of over 300. The proportion of South Asian participants that would qualify for hypertensive therapy is higher among those with a coronary calcium score of over 100. And South Asian men had greater coronary calcium change than Chinese, Black, and Hispanic men, but similar change to that of whites after adjusting for traditional risk factors. Taken together, further assessment with coronary artery calcium may help better personalize statin allocation in these individuals. Thanks to all the excellent research findings from studies such as Masala, our team, along with other domestic and international colleagues, have come forward with an invited expert-driven consensus document that is now available in JACC Advances, listing key considerations based on available data for the management of South Asian patients. Importantly, this should be considered at each visit with the understanding that the risk is on a continuum and ongoing efforts should be made to identify and mitigate risk. A good example of this comes from heart catheterization lab-driven data from Ontario, Canada. In this study, they looked at patients who underwent first-time left heart catheterization for stable coronary artery disease. Overall, South Asians were found to have a higher odds of obstructive coronary artery disease despite a younger age of presentation. Notably, South Asians had the highest prevalence of traditional cardiovascular risk factors, namely diabetes and elevated fasting blood sugar, hypertension, overweight status, and dyslipidemia, all things that we discussed earlier. In addition, South Asians also had the highest use of cardiometabolic therapies, suggesting perhaps broader suboptimal risk factor control, reinforcing the need for ongoing evaluation and risk factor modification. So to summarize, the Masala study represents an opportunity to improve our understanding of cardiovascular health in the South Asian community. Yes, the risk is higher, but we are beginning to understand the mechanisms behind this risk, and studies such as Masala have allowed us to fill in the knowledge gaps and has served as a catalyst to guide management algorithms, such that we start with the fundamentals of identifying and managing traditional risk factors. We risk stratify patients with available risk algorithms. We offer coronary artery calcium imaging to further refine risk to determine if there is benefit to adding on preventive therapy such as aspirin and statins, particularly when the benefit of this therapy is less clear. We offer culturally tailored management recommendations. We aggressively manage established disease. And lastly, we continue to reassess risk at each opportunity of patient contact. Thank you all again for your time today and those who have supported the pivotal Masala study.